are having Martín Pérez Comisso from Chile. And he's going to present exploring anti-futures, negative speculations that constrain situated imagination. Okay, so let's see if Martin is ready.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, could you please open your video?
Good. Video opening. Hello.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Martin, stage is all yours.
Thank you very much. It's to me a pleasure to participate on this conference, and thanks to Aledia for your incredible job as online host for all this week in the different activities. Today from Santiago de Chile, I will want to share with all of you a bit of my research about Latin American futurisms, and I decided to focus in a concept that I have been exploring for the last 3 years that's called anti-futures. I will make this presentation in first person in a similar state like an essay or a presentation that is based like in a rant, and you will in a second understand why. I will keep my image hidden and I will start. She's Ursula Le Guin. Ursula Le Guin is one of the science fiction writers more famous in the world. Her contributions with an anthropological eye due to her personal history and her family make her one of the most detailist and carefully writers in the world. However, she also faced multiple issues in relation to how people understand her work. In 2004, she published a critique to Argentinian translators of science fiction that doesn't consider her work part of science fiction because it has technology enough. In that way, Ursula Le Guin wrote something that is called Rant Against Technology, and her work look for pushing the boundaries in how we understand technology. In a similar way, this presentation, I attempt to push away how we understand images of the future, in particular, how we understand the relationship between the places that we produce those futures and the places that we try to consume it. In that form, this is a rant against anti-futures. I'm tired about places that doesn't exist for anybody, of times that doesn't belong to anyone, and fantasies that colonize our imaginations with false dichotomies. I don't want to continue seeing histories that exoticize the foreign presence, asking us to follow the dreams of the powerful. I don't trust the temporal metaphors of oralities that offers a multiverse that neglects the endangered pluriverse that we share. I refuse to conform with a metaverse that reproduces technological exclusions of the last centuries and is unjust with all those entities that we have around each other surrounding us. I want people to see and avoid anti-futures. I call those anti-futures to temporal non-places, images of the future that disengage of local experiences and past, diluting action with elusive images of the future, restraining the actual possibilities of a community with fantasies that doesn't belong to them. Anti-futures are, in that way, negative space of possibility, and our local temporalities get captured by exogenous, dependent, and colonized ideas. Anti-futures are hard to be seen, as any other thing that is in a negative space are hard to describe because are non-places. Anti-futures are disowned futures in terms of inutolaya that are critically imported, that intoxicate, or expectations about what is coming. Like the myth of El Dorado, they turn all realities in legends that aren't supposed to be endogenous. Knowledges that are export illusions from other lands that we bring to our lives without acknowledging. Are these realities possible in the places that we are? Are those futures viable in the ways that we live? In that way, when we see images of the future about artificial intelligence taking over multiple forms of labor, we forgot that in places like Latin America, informal labor is one of the main source of income of most people. In that way, anti-futures became blind spot or illustrations about the future, yet are present in their absence because the realities that we have doesn't have the possibilities to become those futures that we think that we imagine by ourselves. And the futures became in that way unreachable and inaccessible, yet are clear in the absence of local futurity. Anti-futures, in that way, colonize our imagination. Anti-future are those temporal spaces that are about to be enacted, stealing our attention of the thing that we can really care or we can really do. In that way, images of the future that describe the overcoming of the climate change by fancy technologies are way more harder to achieve in places where basic electrification or even primary education are still to be seen. Those places are everywhere in our planet, and in our societies, we have the challenges to achieve basic human life conditions to everybody that claim for equity get distracted for this kind of anti-futures. And in that way, something that I discovered in my research is that Latin America is full of these anti-futures. Anti-futures that the Puerto Rico power grid as a political anti-future, because the achievement of this depends not about the work of the people locally, but about the restrictions that are given for the physical and intellectual colonization that the US has with this territory. In that way, the condition of sovereignty is a basic element to be able to work those anti-futures, as Rivera Matos has been researcher in her work. Also, the Guadalajara transport system became an infrastructural anti-future because the ways of moving and the mobilities that are available for these people in this big city of Mexico are unable to develop in the ways that are imagined. In that way, the aspirations of the transport and the time and the connectivity that will eventually improve the quality of life of the people in Guadalajara get constrained for political and technical limitations that Mexican people are unable to translate because they get charmed by the imaginations that came from other places but are unable to implement properly. In that way, anti-futures are these images of the future that neglect and disregard the material and political realities that those images of the future are connecting. Our world doesn't have dystopias nor utopias. We are building the world with our actions and our histories in every second. We have contradictions that we have to live with. And in that way, the imagination of the future required to be empowered for each individual with powerful future thinking and not with fantasies that we are unable to actually perform. We must embrace the non-binaries and multiplicities of possibilities and the places of the future within ourselves. We need to ask for the values, all the values that are in our communities. We should integrate the role that any technology has because all depends of the context and the place that they are. We should avoid to support vacuum hopes and void desires that are fully disconnected of the actual material ways in which our lives are happening. Importing images of the future is the main reality that produce these anti-futures. And the challenge is to create fully grounded and careful examination of the cases that we need to envision other ways of being, other ways of doing. In the way, Ursula Le Guin offers a reflection on how can anybody make a history about the future or an alien culture without describing implicitly or explicitly is technology. In that way, we can also think how anybody can make a future without describing implicitly or explicitly its societies. In the complexities that we have in our world currently, we should recognize and acknowledge the importance to deeply situated images of the future. In that way, we should be aware of anti-futures that are vague and inaccessible places for us. Those are covered by the myth of progress that doesn't belong to anyone in particular and came to us from nowhere, but yet are moving forward without including us. Thank you very much for this time to share about this concept and these reflections with all of you. Those are my contacts for all of you.
Well, Martin, first of all, thank you so much for talking about Latin America, because we know that we have very few topics about this. So thanks a lot for that and for wide research on this. Okay, so questions or comments here for Martin, please. Questions or comments?
I guess because this is one of the last presentations in the last day, the energy will be low, but I appreciate to everybody that is connected and everybody will be watching in the future this presentation.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Actually, Martin, you can put your data in the chat in order people to get track of you.
Totally. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. And I have one question for you, Martin.
Please.
Which are the main limitations that you can identify in the people in order to use or to recognize these anti-futures?
I do think a very important thing on why people doesn't recognize anti-futures is because the traditions of imagination and futures that are in their cities or in their communities are typically neglected. We base our future thinking in very theoretical models, in fascinating abstractions that are very helpful in different contexts. However, we forgot what has been imagined in our place. For instance, in this moment, we in Santiago are having the Pan American Games that brings people from all the continent to compete in different sport disciplines. However, this Santiago 2023 is not the first time that Chile has been trying to host this. It happens in the 60s and in the 70s, and both times fail. That means this is the third time that Santiago has been imagined and performed as a sport epicenter. However, many of the mistakes that has been happening these days, that has been fortunately less than expected, came from things that we're envisioning 50 years ago about what means to make these futures and turn the city in a sport epicenter. And when we neglect to bring those elements of the ancient futures that has been imagined for us in the past, we can very easily disregard the local histories and the actual capabilities of the people and the infrastructures and the political systems that turns futures into reality. In that way, there's like multiple drivers of the future that we give for granted, in particular when we are discussing about emerging and trendy topics that are actually not viable in a specific location. One specific example is thinking in how important has been artificial intelligence during this year and how popularized has been this concept. However, rural localities without electricity doesn't have the possibility to envision futures with artificial intelligence yet. Despite the power of artificial intelligence in larger crowded cities that there is a lot in Latin America, not everybody can access the benefits or the risk even of artificial intelligence, because it's a system that requires other systems before to be deployed. And I think those kind of things, to neglecting the local histories of the future and not recognizing the actual situation that people tends to create these anti-futures that are particularly contradictory and very frustrating for people. Like, for instance, one classic, to bring another digital thing, the One Laptop Per Child. It was an amazing program to try to democratize computation and even open software around the world. However, didn't recognize that there is like a lot of people that doesn't have even electricity to run computers, to make the students to self-learn with the possibilities with just using computers, not even internet. And in that way, there is multiple histories, like the ones that like Morgan Ames has described from Paraguay, about how these things fail, not because are bad ideas, but because they neglect the actual realities that those futures of like people learning from each other with computers actually require. And those things change over time, but we make a lot of decisions thinking that those anti-futures are the actual viable and desirable images of the future for places that not actually necessarily are. And in that way, evaluate images of the future is something that in their context is something very important to prevent make these kind of mistakes that also make more difficult to people to trust on the power of future, because we in some way can imagine everything, but we imagine altogether the better worlds, and we trust on those imaginations in the terms that like part of them became new realities in our surroundings or in the surroundings that we are making together in our countries or nations or cities or realities.
Totally agree, and for sure Latin Americans need to get together. Well, not just us, but we are a region, a vulnerable region that need to be reinforced. So we all Latin Americans need to get together for that, and to work towards better futures for everybody.
That's right. And we also need to recognize the works of the people, the previous people do working on futures, and not just the value of those people, but the actual images of the future that they have created with multiple methodologies. Knowing those scenarios and why those scenarios fail or succeed in different reasons is very important, because that is about our future. Our futures are directions that like will be more effective when more people it combines about those images of the future and we work collectively towards them, and that requires to create the trust on the work of futurists, and that implies to know very carefully what images of the future are we deciding to push to be future realities for ourselves or for next generations.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, is there any other question or comment for Martin?
There is something in the chat.
Yeah, Lina Maya says, thank you for the most colorful presentation, Martin. You do know that we people think in pictures.
Highly appreciated. Yes, it's something to bring our imaginations in action.
Nice. Okay, is there any other? Oh, sorry.
I have a question.
Bless you.
Excuse me.
Please.
Yeah, go on, Paula.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the last picture that you have, the beware of anti-futures, vague and inaccessible places for us. So when you're looking at this and you're giving us this caveat of how they can be inaccessible, how would you encourage people to vision futures with a view towards greater inclusivity, so that accessibility is promoted and not, especially when you're looking at it from a visual perspective, how do you then encourage people visually with your visual representation to provide greater accessibility to these visions of the future that you have or that others have when they're elaborating?
Thank you very much, Paula, for your question. I will say two things. I particularly try to bring a new concept in the conversations about the future, and anti-futures try to help us to reflect and evaluate how concrete and link with the local realities are images of the future that we tend to discuss as something that are very important or very relevant in specific discussions. In that way, visual representations had also their challenges. Not everybody has access or the capability to enjoy visual products in a similar way. It's very important to understand that when we talk about images of the future, we talk about representations about the future that doesn't restrict specifically to visual creations, but also to metaphors, to text, to audios of the future. The group of like Centro and Carla Paniagua has developed and published in the Journal Futures Studies a couple of papers about audios about the future. But those audios are also images of the future. And I do think that the mediality about the images of the future is deeply important. But the concept of anti-futures doesn't make an argument about one mediality over other, yet it requires to say what are the sources, the intellectual and the historical and the technical sources of the futures that we are valuing specifically. And something that has been discovered is how in Latin America, multiple images of the future that are in the public sphere, in the discussions that we have about the importance of environmental change, but then we displace that with the importance of like economical development. Those two things seems that are in a contradiction, because in other places in the world, they are in a contradiction. However, when we reflect deeply what it means development in Latin America, and we discover the importance of our natural resources, we can assert that we can make the work in other forms. And the work of like Juan David Reina, for instance, in Colombia, about solar energies and solar futures, shows alternative images of the future, deeply grounded in the local histories, indigenous and colonial histories of Colombia's energy production, that help us to imagine a very different way of energy transition than the ones that we tend to discuss in the global north, and or like the ones that are envisioning in the global north for us in Latin America. The anti-futures are not exclusive of Latin America. I particularly specialize in Latin American ways of futuring. However, we can find this even in the global north, in rural areas of the US, in poor neighborhoods in China, or in areas that are neglected in the south of Europe. And yet, the envisioning and the forcing of images of the future that seems to be like unstoppable make this inaccessibility very present. I do think that we need to recognize that the creation of inclusion is a political decision and need to be done intentionally. Make futures that acknowledge the importance of women and people with disabilities and people of color requires to be intentional on those images of the future and asking us, are these futures really accessible, inclusive, and just? Because multiple images of the future that circulate and came from the most diverse range of methodologies, when they are not intentional in this inclusion, neglect and make inaccessible those realities to a lot of people that they think that they are helping. However, those images of the future create this situation of anti-future, a big promise unable to be fulfilled, that create more rage and lack of hope and despair, because great expectations are unable to happen in that place and time. And because all futures are situated in the places that are created, we should work more carefully in how we analyze and study and discuss about the images of the futures that we consume, produce, and exchange, and also in particular, the ones that we commit to try to make realities.
And what about interfaces of the future? Like in terms of interfacing, how people interface with their world, their community. How do you view accessibility of interfaces of the future? Because not everything is image, obviously, and as you pointed out, audio is also another interface. So what other interfaces do you think are conducive to greater accessibility, to prevent these anti-futures?
Well, I do think that multiple examples of participatory futures can help us to bring those kind of things, from material futures and prototypes that can be made from clay, that allows not necessarily to have a high technological device, even a computer, but you can create futures making prototypes with very simple materials. and bringing those opportunities of imagination for different people. In particular, those people that they might have sensing limitations. And translate futures in different way. Something that I fascinated is how the Museu Mañana in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, they don't just have a huge exhibit that they have 5 stages, but they also have included in a 3D printing of the spaces for people that are unable to see, and braille translations of the conversations, as well like audio for different people. And it's the same content, are the same collections of images of the future, and the same questions that prompt the people to make changes. And I do think having this diversity of plurality on the images of the future and not restricted to a visualization or an audio or a text is very important to make more inclusive images of the future. I hope that answered your question, and thank you very much, Paula, for your comments.
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, everybody. It was really a great presentation.